Welcome to Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Your Daily, there was a fly-in to Washington, D.C. by pork producers last week. We chat with Harrison Furlow about the top discussions there. Then we head over to eastern Iowa. Extension agronomist Rebecca Vitito goes over what the crops look like and rumors of armyworm. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we have Harrison Furlow, the new policy director for the Iowa Pork Producers Association. Harrison, thank you so much for joining us on the program. And we're going to talk about a fly-in that's going on for the Iowa pork producers, and that was last week. So first off, tell me about that. Tell me about the setup and some of the important things you guys were going over.
Sure thing. Yeah, we were happy to participate in National Pork Producer Council. They've got a fall legislative action conference. And so every year, a whole bunch of hog farmers from across the country representing a bunch of different states fly in and visit with their respective legislators. And so Iowa had a great delegation last week, and we were able to visit each of our congressional offices.
Absolutely. And I know a big topic on hand, well, there's a couple, but a big one that we've been going over for it feels like years and years is the Proposition 12 law out of California and its effect on the rest of the country. How is that conversation going?
Sure thing. Yeah, I think that kind of like many producers across the country, we're frustrated. And when you've got one state instructing other states how to raise their livestock, in effect, that creates sort of an uncomfortable precedent and some real issues for our industry. I think our biggest priority in addressing Proposition 12, one is to find the appropriate legislative vessel through which it can be delivered, ideally some version of a farm bill. But then two, recognizing, hey, fundamentally, if we have a patchwork of state regulations that pop up because of the precedent which Proposition 12 sets, we're really going to run into trouble. And so the Supreme Court ruled, right, that this is a fix that Congress has to address. And so now we're asking our representatives to step in and fix it per the Supreme Court's recommendation. And we're cautiously optimistic that in the coming months, Congress can come together and create, again, some sort of legislative vehicle to get a fix to Prop 12 and to stop a patchwork of confusing state regulations that just further mess with our industry.
What does this bill potentially look like? Because we already have the Interstate Commerce Clause. Is this just to emphasize that? Would something like this emphasize that? Or would this be entirely new legislation?
Well, per the Supreme Court, the Interstate Commerce Clause, in their opinion, doesn't affect this specific ballot initiative, right? And so they found that it isn't relevant and doesn't overlook and regulate essentially what California has decided to do here. And therefore, Congress has to come up with some other novel fix, essentially, again, just stating that there's going to be a standard at best, but or alternatively, states just can't step in and create new standards to regulate what happens in other states. So it's sort of this weird other thing beyond what's already regulated in the Commerce Clause, and that's because of the Supreme Court's ruling.
Another big topic to go over on Capitol Hill is the Farm Bill as well. It has been quite a while since we've had a updated Farm Bill for current times. What was the conversation there about that?
Again, I think we're cautiously optimistic, right? When you look at sort of what the Farm Bill has done historically as a legislative vehicle, much of it is budgetary, whether it's SNAP or other sort of federal funds that need to be appropriated in certain places for the ag community. This year, the big, beautiful bill, the reconciliation bill, which passed a couple months ago, sort of took care of many of those things that are traditionally addressed in a farm bill. And so now the question for legislators is, what are the things that we didn't tackle that would normally be in a farm bill package? Is there a way to deliver some sort of skinny farm bill? They've only got so many months left in session. They've got some things that they've got to take care of. And we're just asking our members of Congress to prioritize this. And so we're cautiously optimistic that they can deliver something in the next few months. And again, spend our time on the Hill asking them to do so.
I've heard that term thrown around a couple times, skinny farm bill. Is that another way of saying a year extension, or are they planning for a skinny farm bill to last a full 4 years?
I don't think that the vessel is going to be a traditional farm bill, period. And I question when we would potentially see the sort of standardized farm bill that we've seen for so long. I think the term skinny farm bill is kind of addressing what I mentioned in terms of the budgetary sort of appropriation, which has been dealt with in reconciliation, is sort of out of the way. And that they're really just going to focus on some of the more hot button issue things that you would also see sort of tacked on to a farm bill. And so really the skinny farm bill would likely be more issues focused, but that's up to either Chairman G.T. Thompson or Chairman Bozeman in the Senate to determine what that looks like in their respective chambers.
Let's swap over to trade, obviously a very important aspect of the meat industry, and we've had very successful exports over the last couple of years, especially in pork. How has the trade conversation gone on Capitol Hill last week?
I think we just asked our legislators to make sure that they keep a dialogue with the administration as far as how the impact of tariffs and other trade barriers affect our industry, and just want to make sure that pork and other livestock products are treated fairly and considered as part of the Trump administration's strategy in navigating the tariff and trade landscape.
Any other notes to make? Any other urgent issues that you're feeling from the pork side of things that needed to be touched on, that you had an opportunity to speak with our lawmakers on?
Yeah, I think two big ones were one, the MAHA movement, the Make America Healthy Again movement. We recently saw the Make America Healthy Again strategy document released, and that sort of set a different tone, maybe compared to the initial MAHA report. But we just want to make sure that our legislators understand, just like everybody else in this country, we want our children to be healthy. We want the American citizen to be healthy. But we also want to make sure that we're disseminating appropriate information, especially when you think of pork as a nutrient-dense, protein-rich, nutritious, healthy product. We should be having conversations about that and not creating buzzwords or just completely arbitrary phrases like ultra processed foods and slapping labels on products that again are healthy for Americans. And so again, we're worried about sort of the nature of what this ultra processed food conversation means. We want to make sure that gold standard science is being used and appropriate peer review as part of this process when we are sort of litigating, let's say, what's happening in the food and agriculture space. And then finally, again, if we're going to talk about protein and we're going to be very protein forward, let's talk about pork and what it can do for young people, for developing children, right? And then also maturing folks as well who need protein in their diet. On the labor front, we wanted to talk about sort of what are some opportunities to ensure that farmers across this country have access to labor year round, right? Raising pigs is not a seasonal undertaking. And so year round, we need to have a secure and accessible labor source. And so we talked to members of Congress, and I think that was a good conversation. And in some of their words, right, they feel that President Trump has done a good job in securing the border. Now that we've sort of got a secure border, at least for their appraisal, now we're more willing to talk about other sort of aspects of immigration and ideally some sort of labor solution for our producers who've been hurting so badly in that space. And so I think across the board, we were definitely able to talk about a robust set of issues. We heard some feedback. We're cautiously optimistic both about the Farm Bill, about what's coming down the pike in terms of MAHA and trade, and then, of course, a labor solution as well. And we're grateful for the time that we had in Washington, D.C.
I appreciate it. And just to emphasize with MAHA, essentially the idea is reducing confusion from consumers and having more of a consistent messaging going on from the top levels of government.
Sure. Yeah. Consistent messaging and accurate messaging. Right. And I think that when we get caught up in buzzwords and trends and sort of the social media landscape that we have today, it's easy for folks to sort of lose sight of where the sound science is. And I know that our industry certainly relies on sound science to make decisions, to advocate for our product, and to advocate for best practices on farm. We want to make sure that if the administration is diving into that, they're weighing in, they're considering what we have to say. And we're very proud of the product we raise, and we want to make sure that it's advocated for appropriately.
Harrison Furlow is the new policy director for the Iowa Pork Producers Association, joining us on Farm Here Daily. Harrison, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
This is Farm Here Daily. We will have more conversations on the way, but first, a look at the marketplace. And at the Tuesday market close, there was some green on the board. December corn 6.25 cents higher, 4.29.5. March rising 6 cents at 4.47. Soybeans in November 7 cents more at 10.49 3/4, with January an increase of 7.5 cents at 10.69 1/4. Soybean meal in October 60 cents a ton in the green, $285.80. Soybean oil in October a penny higher at 52.69 a pound. December wheat 9 cents more, 5.34, with March rising 9 cents as well, 5.51 3/4. Hard red winter wheat in December 9.5 cents up at 5.23.5, with March hard red winter wheat 9.5 up at 5.44 1/4. The livestock market closed for Tuesday. October live cattle down $1.15 a hundredweight, $233.45. December falling $1.12 at $235.15. Feeder cattle in October 20 cents a hundredweight lower at $354.30, with November a decrease of 85 cents at $349.40. Lean hogs in October 15 cents a hundredweight in the red, $97.37, with December 62 cents lower at $88.22 a hundredweight. It is the Tuesday market close. This is Farm Year Daily. And joining me on Farm Year Daily, we're going to take a look at the crops in eastern Iowa. To do so, we have ISU Extension agronomist Rebecca Vitito. Rebecca, it's been a while since we last chatted. How are you doing? Thanks for joining us, and tell us about the crops going on in that part of the state.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. Always good to be on, and nice to give an update on kind of where things are at over here in eastern Iowa. So I think it's been, like you mentioned, a little bit since we had talked last, but obviously now, as we're here the middle part of September, harvest has begun over here in eastern Iowa. We first started seeing harvest begin, obviously, on the corn silage side of things towards the end of August. That has basically wrapped up, and we are now focusing on harvesting corn. I haven't seen any beans come out of the field yet, but combine started rolling last week, and obviously the first part here of this week as well, taking corn out of the fields.
That is pretty, I think, on pace for seeing some corn getting out of the fields, but is crop wide much of it really suited to be harvested just yet? I think last week we were seeing still about half not fully at maturity.
Yeah, so it really depends upon the field and how that field was managed partially throughout the growing season. Just between the really wet July that we had and then August, like July was wet and then August was the complete opposite. We were a lot drier. We also saw a fair amount of disease pressure over here, especially with southern rust, which I know that was something that it wasn't just isolated to eastern Iowa. That was something we saw across not just Iowa, but the Midwest in general. And so depending upon how fields are managed, planting date, hybrid maturity, some fields are ready for harvest. Some of the moistures that I've been hearing coming out of the field have ranged from like 17-18% to like 25% moisture. Some people do prefer to take a little bit higher moisture corn out, but some fields are obviously dry enough to come out. And I know one thing I've been encouraging folks to keep a close eye on is standability concerns, especially as we get later into harvest, just with some of the stresses that we had this growing season, seeing some stalk integrity concerns, stalk rots that, if we were to get a wind event later, or as we get later into the harvest season, we could see some standability issues. So keeping an eye on that and, trying to get after it sooner versus later.
Absolutely. And as you're getting after it now, you're seeing folks getting into combines. In fact, I spoke on the phone with two people who are running for mobile offices already today. We are going to be looking at those. I think you mentioned some standability issues. So what are some precautions you're talking with folks about in terms of how to recognize those fields early on to get to them a little bit quicker or prioritize them more?
Yeah, so kind of a easy way we can do that is we can go out and do what we call either the push test or the pinch test. We kind of just want to evaluate and see what percent of the plants are we seeing an issue with that on. So For the push test, you're basically just going to push that corn plant forward, and if it pops back into place, I'm not worried about it. But if I push it forward and it stays leaning forward, basically that tells me I've got a concern with the standability there. Or the pinch test, that's where I'm going to pinch the lower part of the stalk. If it's nice and firm, that's what I want it to be. But if I pinch it and it's squishy or it gives way, that tells me that we've got some concern there. So if we see more than 10% of that in a field, that's a good indicator that we would want to prioritize that field sooner versus later for harvest. And it's always a good idea to not just, check the end rows or one spot of the field. Go to a couple different spots, check 10 plants here, 10 plants in a different part of the field, and do the math to see are we at approximately that 10% of when we'd want to consider maybe harvesting that field a little bit earlier.
Let's go over beans then as well. We were getting some observation that we might get some rain later this month, but it's been very dry so far in September, and some of those bean crops could have used a little bit of water. Are you seeing that in your area, or do they seem to be going pretty strong still heading into harvest?
I would say we're seeing some of that in our area. Some beans probably could have benefited from a late season rain that we did not get. We've been pretty dry. I know yesterday I live in the Washington area, and there was a pocket around Washington that got some rain, but like where we live, absolutely no rain. So it's just kind of that hit or miss on that rain. So if folks that did get those later season rains, the end of August, or here recently, that would help in some fields, but there's already fields obviously starting to turn, and at that point, we're starting to turn, and any more rain's not going to specifically add anything on those fields. I will say with the drier August, I did see the pockets of sudden death syndrome in fields slow down or not progress as much as what I was maybe expecting earlier in the month, just with the amount of sudden death we were seeing earlier. But it kind of makes sense just with the lack of rainfall, not moving that toxin up in the plant and just not seeing those areas expand quite as much.
Let's take one quick glance. We were talking about this beforehand, but there have been some rumors of armyworm in hay fields. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've had a few reports, and I've even seen some fall armyworms. So they do not overwinter here in Iowa, which is a good thing. They fly up from the south, and they, especially when they hatch, they're going to look for something nice and green to eat. And oftentimes this time of the year, we'll see them more so in hay fields, pastures, or if people have already seeded cover crops in fields, those can also be a target as well. So anything nice and green and lush. So most people have taken their last cutting of hay for the year, but it's just a good reminder to just keep scouting those fields. I think a lot of people probably remember 2021 when we had a major outbreak with fall armyworm. And it wasn't just hay fields, even people's lawns we were seeing them in. So if you start to notice, that a spot looks weird in the field, or it looks maybe a little bit of drought stressed, or just like it's not growing back the way that it should, want to kind of keep an eye on that, especially with like hay fields. If we've taken that last cutting, we want to make sure we get the right amount of growth on it before we go into fall. And so if we need to do something, we could potentially, might have to make a insecticide application. The threshold we use is if we see 1 to 2 per square foot, and if they're less than an inch big. So if they're bigger than an inch, it's going to be a lot harder to kill them. Plus, a lot of that damage is already done as well. But if they're smaller and we're seeing that many, we might want to consider doing that just to help, especially as we're heading into winter and making sure we've got that regrowth on those hay fields.
Rebecca Vitito is the East Central Iowa agronomist for ISU Extension. Thank you so much for joining us, Rebecca, and giving us an update on the state of the fields this year.
Thanks for having me.
This is Farm Your Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I'm your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.